There we go. All right. So this is not so much a lecture per se, as a collection of stories, because as I said, this amazing state that we live in is filled with incredible people who go off and do incredible things and then don't tell anybody about it. And then all these stories are left sort of to be found, as it were, almost on a scavenger hunt. So for about the past 4.5 years or so, I've been engaged on that scavenger hunt. And this is sort of the byproduct of it, as is the book, which I'll plug sort of at the end. It is a free book, so don't worry. I'm not trying to make any money off of it. I've already been paid for it by the taxpayers because I was paid to do it at work. And the U.S. taxpayers should get a return on your investment. So definitely request the book for free from Army University Press. So without further ado, this story begins with a National Guard unit, the 2nd Maine Infantry Regiment. In 1917, it was made up of companies from all across Maine, from as far east as Eastport, all the way up to Holton, down to Augusta, all the way out west to Rumford, Norway. And on April 6th, as you know, or you may not know, the United States entered World War I. And the following day, the National Guard was mobilized. Telegrams went out to each armory. Each armory, in each town, they sounded the militia call, which was a series of blasts over the town's fire alarm, the whistle that would sound in the town. And all the young men came into the armories to begin preparations. You have to imagine, that's quite with a unit spread all the way across the state from Holton to Eastport, Augusta, Bangor. That's a long way to go for if you're trying to get anybody together. The first task really was to begin recruiting. So recruiting drives began immediately to fill up all these companies to what was then the wartime strength. Prior to the war, the authorized strength for a National Guard company was 94 officers and men. Now they needed to fill to 150 men. Brothers, cousins, uncles, nephews, all joined up, oftentimes in the same units. Immigrants joined, many of them from Western Maine, Italians working in the shoe factories, the railroads. Immigrants like Albert and Eric Klick were both immigrants from Mecklenburg, Germany, in a time where to be German was very suspicious, almost criminal in some cases. One of the things that the Maine National Guard had to do in 1917, a very uncomfortable task, was register enemy aliens, as they were known. But here you have 2 men from Waterville, 2 Germans who enlist into Company H of the 2nd Maine Infantry, into the Waterville Company. Both men would be wounded in action twice. Albert would earn the Distinguished Service Cross as well, second only to the Medal of Honor as an award for valor. Now, I love these posters. These are phenomenal little shots in time. So these are recruiting posters that would go up by the Public Safety Committee. You've got great lines like, this is a measure of Maine's patriotism. Regiment wants unmarried men without dependents 18 to 45. And then every man between 21 and 30 who enlists now will be credited to the draft. And of course, that's a big piece. Maine had a certain allocation of personnel that would be swept up within the Selective Service Act that had been passed really just the year before, and now would be bringing in more enlistees into the state or into the service. And then these men are Maine men, and they are volunteers. Really making that emphasis. This is a volunteer outfit. This is not draftees. They all want to be here. So the companies begin assembling at their hometowns. Here you have Company K in Farmington, mobilizing in the spring of 1917, and nobody knew what the National Guard was going to do. At the outset of war, everyone thought, well, the Navy is going to do the big hauling here. The Navy's actually The Navy actually has ships and can do things. The Army is 130,000 regulars, about another 120,000 in the National Guard. We ranked somewhere just behind Hungary as a military power. So no one was really confident that the that the U.S. Army was really going to be able to do much of anything. Probably not until 1918, 1919. But these National Guard companies are called up, and they are at first sent off to guard duty around the state. They were guarding critical installations that were believed to be vulnerable to German spies and saboteurs, such as railroads and bridges, the port facilities in Portland, Bath Iron Works, the Kittery Shipyard. And you might say to yourself, nobody's going to come to Maine to blow anything up. That's just silly. Well, I got a story for you. 1915, a U-boat surfaces off the coast of Canada, drops off a German spy. He makes his way to the bridge between the US and Canada at Vanceboro, goes ahead and sets up his little demolitions charge, doesn't tamp his demolitions properly, not a very good sapper, and tries to blow up the bridge. He's about 50% successful. One span is slightly damaged. But the problem is now everyone knows, something's going on. And if you've ever been up to Vanceboro, not a lot going on in Vanceboro, Maine. So a German spy is definitely quite an item of excitement. And if you also know Vanceboro, there's not that many people there. So they all sort of look around at each other and go, well, we know it wasn't you, but who's this new guy who showed up? And he said, when confronted, he said, yes, I did it. He's smoking German cigarettes as well. So not a good spy. He admitted to having done it. And they said, all right, well, off to prison with you. So bad spy, bad saboteur, but the damage had been done. The psychological damage, that is, not so much the physical damage. If you look at the news now, any type of terrorist attack, anything like that happens somewhere in the country, it can get spun all up and people get concerned. Imagine how Mainers felt that the war, this faraway thing, had suddenly come to their shores in 1915. And everybody began to freak out. The Bangor Daily News talked about, said if all the reports that we're hearing are true, the woods above Maine are just covered in Zeppelins. The coast from Portsmouth all the way up to Eastport is just nothing but U-boats as far as the eye can see. So in part, these troops were going out to try to calm the populace and wait for further orders. This period of guard duty lasted from May to July. And as the months rolled on, it became more and more likely that the National Guard was probably going to be called up for federal service in France. But they weren't quite sure yet. Now, this guard duty was not without danger. Peter Klein, pictured here from Norway's Company D, happens to be the company that I command today, actually, who he had dropped out of high school to enlist when the war was declared, was accidentally killed by a train on May 20th, 1917, near Biddeford. Just days later, Corporal Philippe Simard of the same company shot an intruder on the bridge in Biddeford who failed to answer his commands to stop. The man later died. His name was Hassan Suleiman, an immigrant from Albania who was working at the mills in New York and most likely did not know any English. Now, Peter Klein, interesting, he was part of a small Jewish community in Norway. He was one of 7 kids, pretty much all of whom would serve in some capacity during the war. His older brother would be wounded in action fighting with the 3rd Division the following summer, but his sister served in the Red Cross, the YMCA, and so just a phenomenal record of service from that one family. Whoops. Yes, so sorry, I went one faster. So as the companies were on guard duty, their recruiting continued. Recruiting stations were instructed to stay open from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. every day of the week, including Sunday. And if you know anything about that time, that's a huge deal. People didn't do that. You didn't keep things open on Sunday. Everything shut down. Governor Milliken asked that the veterans, Civil War veterans and Spanish American War veterans come out to encourage the local young men to enlist. I'm not sure how successful that would be if you came to a recruiting station and there was a guy there missing both legs and said, yeah, I left my legs at Cold Harbor. The Army is great. Give it a shot. I'm not quite sure how well that would go for them. Love this photo. This is Lieutenant Frank J. Burbank of Company C out of Livermore Falls. Recruiting here in Livermore Falls. This corner looks almost exactly the same today as it did then. And I love the photo because you get to see the great cross section of Mainers at this time. You have not only clerks and factory workers, but farmers, people from all different walks of life who are beginning to enlist. We'll see Frank Burbank a little bit later on. Also, he will eventually receive the Distinguished Service Cross. One group of enlistees comes from a very unlikely quarter that May. 9 men from the Passamaquoddy Nation at Pleasant Point join up in Eastport's Company I. If you know much about Native Americans at this time, they were not US citizens. They would not gain citizenship until the 1920s. Did not even have the right to vote. They would not get the right to vote federally till in the 1950s, and in Maine until the 1960s. But they felt very strongly that their homeland needed to be defended. So they enlisted into the first outfit that was nearby, which was Company I of the 2nd Maine Infantry. Now, one of these men is the chief's son. So the chief, the Passamaquoddy governor, William Neptune, is standing in the center. His son is kneeling on the far right. That's Moses Neptune. Notably, out of these 9 young men, by war's end, 2 would be killed and 4 would be wounded. This is a snapshot of just how Native American service through World War I tended to be much higher per capita than the white service, and they suffered much higher casualties as well. As an example of how close-knit these companies were, here you've got Leroy Hoskins, excuse me, Company F, with his 2 uncles, Lewis and Fred. Leroy would be wounded in action severely on July 10th near Belleau Wood, while his uncle Lewis was killed in action on November 5th near Verdun, just before the war's end. Milo, of course, is a very small town, and so you can imagine just how the impact of those casualties in that small family would have on the town. But multiple sets of brothers, cousins in each regiment. Rumford's Company B had 8 arsenals from Rumford in Mexico, cousins and brothers serving together. Now, the man who would be leading Maine's regiment off to war, once they ever figured out where they were going, rumors were flying everywhere that summer. Some people said Panama, some people said China. And Colonel Hume, the man pictured here, the regimental commander, had a pretty good idea of what was going to happen. Now, looking at him, this guy is an unlikely leader. He's got his thick glasses. He had terrible eyesight because of a bout of scarlet fever as a child, ever-present either pipe or cigarettes. He looked more like a postmaster than a combat leader, which is appropriate as he was the postmaster for Halton. He was known for being a fair leader who enjoyed his profanity. In his office in Halton, he had a sign above his desk that said, "Profanity expressly forbidden. Not that we give a damn, but it sounds like hell to the customer." All this aside, Hume had seen service in Cuba in the Army of Occupation in the Spanish-American War, had led the 2nd Maine Regiment down to the border, Mexican border in 1916 for a period of 4-month service. He never forgot a soldier's name. He would remember soldiers' names 20 years later, just passing them on the street in Portland or Bangor. And he was known to be a very caring leader. As the regimental chaplain said, Reverend Moody from Vermont, he said, "To Hume, his men were men, not merely rifles." On July 5th, the companies of the 2nd Maine Infantry began to assemble at Camp Keys in Augusta. Finally assembled as a regiment, they were reviewed by Major General Clarence Edwards, the division commander of what was going to be the 1st National Guard division organized. He'd come up from Boston, and he hinted that orders were soon to come, sending the 2nd Maine Infantry into his division. So here you've got a great shot up at Camp Keys a little bit more sparse now. The airfield hadn't been built then. You've got the companies marching along. The band that you see in the background there is actually, that is the University of Maine band. They all enlisted together in 1917. And they became the regiment's band. You also have walking with the parading at the front of the company. You see the dog down there, I hope. The dog is probably, I believe this is Company H of Waterville, and I believe that dog is named, the one that is named Old Blue. He was a hop-on the train on the way back from their time, the regiment's time, down on the Mexican border from the town of Hoxie, Arkansas. Don't ask me how I know these things. Like I said, I've done a lot of, I don't know. I don't know how I know all this stuff, but stories just keep falling in my lap. The regiment was known for having an absurd number of mascots. Company K from Farmington had a bear. One company had a set of deer. One company had a monkey. The bear would actually, when they were in Augusta, would walk around the streets of Augusta on a leash, and people would give it ice cream. So definitely can imagine the excitement in Augusta with these 2,000 troops now at Camp Keys beginning their training. It was hot that summer, incredibly hot. The temperature is soaring up into the upper 90s. So you can imagine how uncomfortable that was. Augusta turned into an armed camp. There was actually a machine gun range that was put in Camp Keys, and I'm thinking it was firing around the spot where the Shaw's is today on the side of Western Ave there. But that's slightly unconfirmed. I have yet to go see if I can find any type of rounds or anything like that. I imagine they would have all been gone, but it gives you an idea that just how vibrant Augusta was at this time. On August 23rd, under a lowering sky and then eventually gouts of rain, the 2nd Maine left for Westfield, Massachusetts, where a new organization was taking shape. And this was the 26th Division, made up of all the National Guard units of New England. The 2nd Maine was ensconced in Camp Bartlett under the shadows of the Berkshires. And it was here that 1,500 officers and men of the 1st New Hampshire Regiment and 400 men from the 1st Vermont and a smattering of officers and men from the old Massachusetts and Rhode Island National Guard were added to the unit, bringing the regiment to a strength of 3,800 officers and men. And as part of this new transition into the Army, the federal service, the new organization was given a new name, the 103rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, one of 4 infantry regiments inside the 26th Division, which would gain the nickname the Yankee Division. Presumably because Red Sox Division was too awkward. I don't know. But they were Red Sox fans. We definitely knew know that from correspondence. Whoops. The 103rd had really barely been in Massachusetts for a month when orders came suddenly and secretly. They were shipping out. The rapid movement came from sort of a wild disobedience demonstrated by General Edwards. Division was actually supposed to go south for training, but Edwards decided that he wanted his division to be the very first in France. So now correct me if I'm wrong, General Libby, but major generals aren't supposed to sort of co-opt all transports that they can find in every single port up and down the eastern seaboard from Halifax down to New Jersey. But this is what Major General Edwards did. He actually stole the transports from the 42nd Division, Doug MacArthur's division, which I'm sure Douglas MacArthur, being so very forgiving and not at all a personality, he didn't mind in the least. That's sarcasm there. He was quite a harsh man sometimes. So he scrounged every transport he could get. He assembled all of his troops on them, and he didn't notify the War Department until the convoy departed Halifax, Nova Scotia, sending a telegram back. This did nothing to endear Major General Edwards to General John Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Force. And this would cause more friction as these New Englanders head off to their eventual date with destiny. But from Boston, the troops all traveled by rail to New York City, to New Jersey, some even actually went by rail to Halifax. A convoy assembled, and the convoy headed out through the U-boat infested waters to England. Now, this is a picture of the RMS Saxonia, a converted Cunard liner. The men called her the Starvonia. As a guy from Bangor wrote, nothing but boiled pork and boiled rabbit, sometimes with the fur still on it. But you have to imagine what an incredible experience this was for some people who had never left not only the state of Maine, but probably not even their counties. So this is eye-opening for quite a few individuals. Just to orient you to where they're going to be going, this is the charming place known as the Western Front. Salubrious, I hear in the spring. The convoy arrived in Liverpool, England, without much incident. The troops encamped near Borden on Salisbury Plain. The weather was wet, cold, and rainy, just like British weather should be, apparently. And the food was very much the same. The troops were not unhappy when, after a week, they made the rough channel crossing to Le Havre, when were then packed into boxcars, trundled into their first stop in France, the small town of Liffol-le-Grand, and the training area of Neufchâteau. So the Western Front at this time is the yellow line, the stabilized front, 1915 to 1917. Just to remember, just as a reminder for your World War I history, in the fall of 1917, Russia, that had been fighting on the side of the Allies, removes itself conveniently from the fight by deciding to have the Russian Revolution. This now frees up many thousands of Germans to switch from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. And as the Americans begin to just start to arrive in France, the Germans are planning one single knockout blow that is going to knock the Allies out of the war before the Americans can arrive there in great numbers. The first Americans arrived in June of 1917, several regiments of the 1st Infantry Division. The first full division that is going to arrive in France, 28,000 troops, will be our very own 26th Division. They arrive expecting sunny France, and wouldn't you know it, we're from Maine, we go away and it snows. The 103rd arrived in France just in time for literally the coldest winter on record in decades. Adding to this misery, since the 26th was one of the first 4 divisions in France, and because they were without any support troops at the time that would arrive later, they had to offload all their own supplies, buy their own food or scrounge it from inventive ways, find their own trucks, on and on and on. When the troops were not training, they were taking part in working parties. So consequently, their training was rushed. Still, they trained as best they could under French tutelage. They constructed a massive network of training trenches, learning how to live in them, supply them, and maintain them. But they were also training in open warfare. General Pershing believed that the war had become static because the Allies allowed themselves to be bound to the trenches. He believed that open warfare and maneuver was what was going to win the war. Now, the Allies, they'd already tried that, and it's why they began digging trenches. They tried the open warfare thing against machine guns and heavy artillery. It resulted in millions of casualties. So the Allies, especially the French, were training the Americans how to survive on the Western Front. Now, this training lasted from October of 1917 until January. You could see just how incredibly pleasant it was. I like the line, I like the picture of all the troops standing in line, because for all those of us who have served, there is nothing more characteristic of the US military than standing in a line, and probably for a reason that you don't know why. It's just you saw a line and you got in it and you thought, you know what, I should probably be in this line because I'll be asked to get in it eventually. It'd be better to be towards the front. Nothing's changed in 100 years. Now, lest you think that these are hard-bitten professional soldiers, I will remind you that they were closer to children than grown men. These are photos from Bangor's Machine Gun Company and some from Augusta's headquarters company. The one at the top left, I believe you're all probably familiar with the characteristic Prussian helmet that has a spike coming out of the top, the Pickelhaube, which incidentally was the US Army's dress uniform from the 1870s to 1890s, because reasons. The Germans were the dominant military and we wanted to look like them. Anyway, these wags from the machine gun company decided that they were going to make fun of that by sticking their fingers behind their helmets and doing a silhouette shot. Bottom right, you have some guys who are just leaning back, wanting to take a nice picture, and then they get photo bombed by their buddy, who's there with a trench knife, just once again showing boys will be boys, even though when they're about to go off to war to make the world safe for democracy, as Woodrow Wilson said. Now, at the end of January, the French asked the 26th Division if they could spare a battalion of troops to man frontline positions on the Chemin des Dames, which is a long ridge line along the Western Front. The division commander, General Edwards, went one better. He volunteered the entire division. So starting at the beginning of February, the 103rd, along with the 26th Division, moved into their first active front. This road, it's the Chemin des Dames, or translated in English, the Road of the Ladies, referred to the road that ran along a rather lengthy ridgeline that gave excellent line of sight along either side. It had been the scene of horrific carnage the year prior. The French attacking it to take it back from the Germans suffered incredible, massive casualties that literally caused the French army to go into mutiny. The landscape looked like the surface of the moon. Private Howard Crosby from Fairfield wrote, quote, "Everywhere was ruins and desolation. You may rest assured that these sights made a profound and lasting impression upon us who were experiencing such scenes for the first time." So in the picture here, you've got Pignon Forest up at the left. This was the regiment's first line, where their first line of outposts was along a canal. And then on the right, the village of Cruy. That was what was left of the village. And Colonel Hume made his headquarters in one of the cellars in the village. And bottom, just as a reminder, this is how it looks today. Beautiful farmland in France. A unique feature of the Chemin des Dames was that the area was riddled with quarries and caverns. These were limestone quarries that had been mined really since the Middle Ages, and of course used in wartime for shelter, used by troops from Napoleon and from the Napoleonic Wars all the way through. And soldiers being bored in these underground quarries, they were quite nice. I mean, they were, I say nice. They had electric lights. They pumped oxygen into it. They had a light rail system that ran through it to deliver supplies. There were beds anchored into walls, but you're still living underground. And you could house over 1,000 troops in some of these. But bored soldiers being bored, they decided to start, using their bayonets to carve things into the walls. Leaving behind an incredible collection of carvings. Here's just one sample from mechanic Ali Ardeen of Company G from South Brewer, and this incredible shield that he carved with his bayonet. And for more on this, you can watch Americans Underground, Secret Cities of World War I, that talks about all these underground carvings left by Mainers in these quarries. And really, because they're underground, they really haven't been touched in 100 years, so they're very well preserved. So the regiment settled into duty on the Chemin des Dames, nominally a quiet front. Now, when I say quiet, that means 30 to 40 artillery rounds per day versus hundreds. Each of the 3 battalions would rotate off the front lines for 2 weeks at a time. And the front at the time was a series of outposts on a canal, where the Americans and Germans glared at each other across the divide. The Yankees basically shot at anything that moved because they were new troops, and they would send out patrols. Lieutenant Frank Burbank, back in Company C, kept a meticulous notation of his company's patrols, including listing out the number of grenades that were thrown during one at what turned out to be some ducks in the canal. "They missed," said Burbank ruefully, "so no roast duck for us." The real danger, however, was the German artillery, and it was the big guns that began to take a toll. Ralph Moen from Machias in Company K wrote, "I shall never forget that peculiar feeling in my stomach when I heard the first heavy shell whistling over my head. And it was from this that the unit began to take its first casualties in early February of 1918. February 13th, Sergeant Herbert Butler of Company H was wounded in action by a shell fragment. On the same day, Company K was digging trenches near the quarries. A German bombardment began to come in, and the company ran for cover. Private Ralph Spaulding from Madison ran back to grab his helmet and was killed by a shell fragment. His last letter home had been on February 11th, talking of a growing, sober mentality towards the war, but harboring hope that he would be home soon enough. Not only was Spaulding the first soldier of the regiment to be killed in World War I, also the first soldier of the division, and as far as I can tell from research, the very first National Guard soldier to be killed in World War I, Ralph Spaulding from Madison, Maine. Colonel Hume began to receive the reports of his first casualties with tears streaming down his cheeks. And again, as Chaplain Moody said, to him, his men were not merely rifles. By the end of March, again, about two months on the front lines, the 103rd was coming off of its time on its training front, having learned how to survive on an active front line and sustaining first casualties. Moving from the Chemin de Dame did not leave the war behind them, however. Far from it, they were moving into the much more volatile Toul sector. Trenches were little more than holes full of mud, surrounded by shelled landscapes and bombed out buildings. Now, this was a sector of the line that had been fought over since 1914, 15, 16, and 17. It is down here on the map, the Saint-Mihiel salient. And where they're posted is on the bottom of the salient. So a very different front line than everything that they had seen thus far. Oh, and that stayed. There we go. I'm still learning Zoom. You would think I would know after teaching a class all semester that how to do this. I'll get there someday. All right. These are the look of the trenches at the time. The area that they were in was very low ground next to several pools and streams. The trenches filled with water most of the time. So half the time they were just trying to keep their feet dry. Much better picture here. And you can see the two things that they spend most of their time doing on the front line, stringing up barbed wire, and on the right, keeping their feet dry. You notice the duck boards there, a great shot of the soldiers living in the trenches, and just the utter destruction that was around them. The men lived within hundreds of yards of the enemy. Snipers exchanged fire during the day. Any activity would draw down a barrage of artillery fire. The Germans had excellent observation positions on the tall hill of Montsec just nearby that always seemed to be watching down on them. And they played a minor role in a few scraps in April, helping repulse a German assault around the Bois Brûlés, literally the burnt woods, a forest near Apremont. But on May 10th, the regiment experienced its really first harsh touch of war when the 1st Battalion, so the companies from Rumford, Norway, Dexter, and Livermore Falls, were hit with a massive poison gas attack, mustard and phosgene, enveloping the entire position. 200 men had to be evacuated off the line, and 25 were killed in this horrific barrage, most of them from the Norway area. This is going to be the first of many sort of what we would call mass casualty events for the regiment, and it now brings the hard hand of war back home to Maine. In June, the 103rd took over a front line around the twin towns of Zivray and Morvanson. Both towns had been shelled into literal rubble, and there were 3 companies of the 103rd manning the frontline position on June 16th, when they were jarred awake at around 4:30 a.m. by U.S. artillery firing at Germans that were seen approaching. 3 German columns. The Germans then dropped what's called a box barrage around the companies, trying to pin them in by fire dropping on all sides. Approximately 600 picked German troops led by Sturmtruppen. These were special assault troops where this is all they did. They went up and down the Western Front executing raids. They were very, very good at what they did. They swarmed the lines of the 103rd, armed with machine guns and flamethrowers, and they rushed the 103rd's trenches, expecting them to be cowering down and sheltering from artillery fire. Instead, the New Englanders greeted them with a barrage of rifle and machine gun fire, showers of grenades, stopping them cold. On the left here, musician Arthur John Stowell from the University of Maine. He had joined up with the 103rd's band. During the early morning fighting in Zivray, he was a litter carrier, and he rushed into the town. As he was moving a wounded soldier onto the litter, he himself was severely wounded by shrapnel in his legs and back. And as recorded in a letter to Stowell's parents from Private Hastings of the medical detachment, quote, he volunteered to go out in no man's land to carry back a wounded man on a litter. There he received his wounds, and because another man in the infantry was more severely wounded than he, refused to be carried back until the other comrade had been evacuated to the rear. In other words, he sacrificed himself for the sake of another man, regardless of his station, command, or rank. What a noble, Christ-like deed. Stowell would die of his wounds later that afternoon. Now, the barrage had literally ruined the trenches held by the 103rd and killed and wounded dozens of soldiers. In the center there, you have Samuel Dana, one of the Passamaquoddy, next to Charles Lola, one of his comrades, another of the Passamaquoddy. They were equipped with an automatic rifle, holding a frontline position out in front of the town. Their orders had been to evacuate when the barrage began. They disobeyed orders and stayed put. And thus, when the first German column approached, they were struck by the rifle fire from the automatic rifle fire from these two individuals. Charles Lola was killed in action by machine gun fire, holding his position, while Sam Dana, pictured here, was wounded in action, would eventually lose his leg. This action brought Lola the Croix de Guerre, the French Award of Honor, and he probably should have received the Distinguished Service Cross, but there was a strong prejudice against Native Americans in the military at the time. Their actions checked that first German column heading into the town. With all columns momentarily checked, Irvin Doane from Hamden, who you see there on the right, he was in command of a platoon, or a company rather, in Zivray. And as the Germans attacked, he ran back through the barrage that was falling to bring up the reserve platoon, and then ran back through the barrage again and observed that a party of Germans had seized a young man from Eastport, a wounded US soldier from Eastport, and was carrying him back to the German lines. Doane asked for volunteers. Naturally, the entire company stepped forward. He picked 6 others, and they ran out into no man's land, recaptured the individual, and captured the Germans. The German officer, one of whom was a German officer, and the German officer said, your men had no right to be here coming through the barrage like that. They might have all gotten killed. But Devil Doane, as his nickname became that day, didn't quite see it that way. He would go on to fight through the rest of the war, be wounded in the summer offensives, decide that he enjoyed the army for some reason. I think it's kind of crazy when someone goes through World War I and they go, I'd like a little bit more of this, please. And he stayed in the regular army. And by 1941, he was a colonel in the Philippines, which is a really, really bad time to be in the Philippines and be in the US Army. He would command the Provisional Air Corps Regiment, which was basically pilots who no longer had any planes because they'd been shot down by the Japanese. And he would fight for 56 days in the jungles against the Japanese, eventually be captured, make and survive the Bataan Death March, be held in captivity until August of 1945, one of the longest POWs, longest held US POWs in World War II. And then he would come back to Maine and be a Maine guide, possibly because he wanted some peace, and I think he deserved it. So after the 103rd had beat up the Germans at Zivray, for which they received a commendation not just from French leadership, but from General Pershing himself, the 103rd was drawn off the line at the end of June. Now, rumors are present always, we know this. in every military. Rumors said that they were headed for Paris. And for once, it seemed like rumors were true, that trains were even headed in that direction. Discerning doughboys could see the Eiffel Tower emerging in the distance, causing, of course, their excitement to grow. But it was not to be. At Noisy-le-Sec, the train station outside Paris, the trains turned around and headed back towards the front. And on July 4th, the 103rd Infantry began to replace elements of the Marine Brigade outside the town of Château-Thierry in Belleau Wood. Map reference here, just to give you an idea of where we're at with the En-Marne offensive, down around Château-Thierry and then Belleau Wood there. The German spring offensive had punched through the main line, closed within half the distance to Paris, was crossing the Marne River, checked at all fronts by determined defense by American and French and British soldiers, and the line began to stabilize. And into this inferno went the men of the 103rd. This is the area as it looks today. It is calm now, peaceful. In the summer of 19, it was a hellscape. The 2nd Division soldiers and Marines had been fighting for a month to control this small area, this 24-acre of land at Belleau Wood. The men wrote that when they got into Belleau Wood itself, they could not even dig in because there were so many bodies shallow buried. The fields of wheat around the Belleau Wood offered scant protection and cover to the men who lay out in them all day long in the hot sun. To this day, there are still visible reminders of the battle around the area. Munitions and foxholes litter the landscape. I just kicked this German rifle cartridge up with my foot as I was walking along. You can see the foxholes there from the 6th Marines, later occupied by the men of the 103rd. And from July 4th to the 17th, the 103rd held their frontline position under artillery fire almost constantly, including poison gas, and engaging in small skirmishes with German patrols for 2 weeks of exhausting existence. Until on July 17th, the commanders of the 2nd and 3rd battalions received orders to make an attack the next morning. The 3rd Battalion, companies from Holton, Augusta, Farmington, and I knew it was going to happen. Eventually, I was going to start forgetting where the companies were from. Augusta, Holton, Farmington, and Dover, Foxtrot. There we go. Their objective was to take the village of Torcy, situated on a hilltop adjacent to strategic Hill 193. The 2nd Battalion, companies from Skowhegan and Bangor and Waterville, were ordered to seize a railroad line and hold it in the middle of the line. In a driving rain that night, the battalions made their way to their jumping off points. The 3rd Battalion stepped off at 4:30 a.m. on July 18th, as seen in this picture. You can actually see in front on the hillside out there, there's a bursting shell. This is the ground as it looks today. Fields of wheat planted now as then. Major Bill Southard would lead the 3rd Battalion into action that day. A cane in one hand, a cigar clenched in his teeth, and a bottle of cognac, allegedly, in the other. This Bangor man led his battalion into battle. This is actual footage of the 3rd Battalion after they've moved out into their jumping off point before moving on Torcy. Bayonets are fixed. Officers and NCOs are checking the line, synchronizing watches. The last final checks and preparations are made, and then they go over the top behind a barrage, moving over the slope of the hill and down to the village of Torcy, and begin engaging the Germans. I think it is absolutely wild that we have video footage of this. This is due to the 26th Division's photographic camera crew, which actually took prisoners that day because the Germans mistook the video camera on its large tripod for a new type of American machine gun. Gotta love that ingenuity. Another photo taken that morning. This is the 3rd Battalion following its barrage down into Torcy, seizing it before the Germans woke up, as Major Southard said. In hand-to-hand fighting in the streets, rooting the Germans out of the houses with grenades. and seizing the far side of the village. Once in Torcy, they began to consolidate their position. Seen here is the regimental signal detachment. And I love this shot because, yes, World War I is a modern war. There's telephone. There are the beginnings of radio. But it's also, it's connected to the old ways of making war, which is why you have the guy carrying the basket of pigeons over there on the left. You can imagine that when someone said, well, what did you do during World War I? Well, I carried a basket of pigeons around with me. At least he had company. This photo shows the men of Company L from Holton who had just seized the far side of the town and are getting ready to dig in. Sergeant Algernon Holden of Holton was in this group and related that the Germans soon took the company under fire with both artillery and machine guns. One soldier from Company L was killed in this, and Holden actually crawled over to check on him. He was a man he had known for a long time. And he recounts in his post-war writings that at the sight of his friend, he remembered absolutely nothing. His mind went blank. And apparently one of his soldiers saw him crawling out into no man's land and asked him where he was going. To get killed and get it over with, replied Holden. And the soldier grabbed him, pulled him back into the trench and into safety, and he fell asleep and woke up and then continued fighting. The town was almost completely destroyed in this fight. Seen here are the church, which has been rebuilt, and the town hall, which still has the pockmarks from rifle fire. The church was actually used as an observation post where Private Alva White, also from Holton, was posted when he spotted a large Dodge car coming down the road. And it was bearing none other than Colonel Hume, who could not bear to be away from the front lines any longer. A line of bullet holes along the side of the car bore witness to his being under fire. And for the next 2 days, the battalion would hang on to Torcy until the rest of the regiment could make a critical breakthrough. Now, the 2nd Battalion had a far, far different experience. To get to their jumping off point, they had to move through Bellow Wood, which was an absolute nightmare of a place. You can see pictures of it here at the far edge of it. Bodies had been blown into trees. The stench of death was everywhere. Men actually had to wear gas masks to try to withstand the smell as they moved through it. And as they moved through the wood, they were hit with the German bombardment, killing and wounding many men. This is Bellow Wood as it looks today. This is that side. Much more peaceful place, the Enmarn American Cemetery, the final resting place for many of our soldiers from Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, alongside Marines from the 2nd Division. The trench line is barely visible here on the left, but it was out of these that the battalion made their assault at 7:30. Its goal was the railroad bed. You can see here this green portion on the edge of the field. They were caught in a murderous crossfire as soon as they left the woods by machine guns, artillery, and they reached the railroad bed, but were pinned down all day and were unable to maneuver. As night fell, Captain Hosford, commanding the battalion, realized he would not be able to hold on much longer as Germans were beginning to outflank him. And so he withdrew to Bellow Wood. The casualties had been horrific, probably one of the bloodiest days in Maine's history since the Civil War. You can see that I'm holding in my hand on the right there, that is a shrapnel ball. The Germans would fire these over in basically large canisters. They would explode overhead, and that would be shot down in clusters, causing a lot horrible wounds and death in many cases. Probably the most poignant tale of July 18th is the story of the Skowhegan High School squad in Skowhegan's Company E. These young men had joined up just prior to graduation. This is their graduation photo. They graduated together. The Company E was on the left side of the attack and was exposed to some of the most brutal fire during the assault. Sergeant Casimir Bisson was hit on his way out of the woods, wounded. Private Brooks Savage called out to Corporal Alvin Bucknam, "How badly is Cass hurt?" And Bucknam replied, "Pretty bad, I guess." But they moved on. The squad moved out into the wheat fields where Corporal Harry St. Ledger, also of the squad, was hit. When his comrades had reached the railroad embankment, he slowly crawled down through the wheat until he reached them. And Private Savage bound the wounds of the former Skowhegan high school football star, gave him water, but the corporal soon died. He had been seeing a young woman in Skowhegan prior to the war by the name of Margaret Chase, who of course would be Margaret Chase Smith. And it was one reason, because he had died in France, that she became such a passionate advocate for veterans in her later on political career. Under fire by the railroad, Corporal Bucknam, also of the squad, was talking with Private Joseph Bolduc while standing in an exposed position, trying to spot a German machine gun nest. As Bolduc implored him to get under cover, a bullet caught Bucknam in the left side, pitching him over and into the embankment. "Roll for the ravine, Bucky. It's your only chance," yelled Bolduc. Bucknam did, but died from his wounds. Both men are actually buried the same distance apart from each other in Skowhegan, in the Skowhegan Cemetery, as they were when they fell in France. And you can visit that today. It was only afternoon and the Skowhegan High School squad was nearly gone. The only person to escape unscathed from the war was Clyde Badger. The rest of the squad was killed or severely wounded. July 19th, the lines remained stable and static, both sides staring at each other. July 20th, the Americans realized that if they were going to break the strong German defensive position that ran along a high ground known as the Etchepi Plateau, they were going to need to seize the key to that. The key to that was Hill 190. This photograph is taken from the German position, looking out towards Belleau Wood. And you have the towns of Belleau and Torcy over there on the left. And this is the ground that Americans would have to cross over. It's about a mile. We talk about Pickett's charge being about a mile. This is about a mile under machine guns and artillery fire. A tall task. And this task was given to the 1st Battalion to take and hold Hill 190. Following a preparatory barrage at 3 o'clock, Company C from Livermore Falls led the first wave out, but practically disappeared in a wave of machine gun fire. Company B from Rumford came after them, and they made it over the railroad embankment and across the stream at the bottom of the hill, and then began working their way up the slope in small groups. Norway, the company from Dexter and Norway got hung up over there on the right with German machine guns in the ravine at the bottom of the hill. In this action on Hill 190, Private Joseph Arsenault was hit and wounded here. He was one, a reminder, these are one of 8 in the company. His brother Lucien was wounded twice, each time refusing to be evacuated and pressing on. The 3rd time he hit, it was mortal, and he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Small groups of men moved forward and silenced the machine guns, including Lieutenant Frank Burbank, who would by himself clear 2 German machine gun nests. And by nightfall, the hill was in US hands. The cost had been high. Out of the 1,000 men that charged out of Belleau Wood that afternoon, 200 made it to the top of the hill. Companies B and C only had 1 officer each who had not been killed or wounded. Major James Hansen, the battalion commander, who would go on to be the adjutant general for the state of Maine from Belgrade, sent a message back to Colonel Hume that he had taken the position but had lost many men, but if necessary would hold to the last man. This would become the regiment's motto in 1924, and it would continue to be in the regiment's current incarnation as the 133rd Engineer Battalion, continues to be our motto to this very day. The Germans pulled back that night, their lines broken, and on July 21st, there was a general advance, pursuing the retreating Germans from back nearly 9 miles. From July 22nd to 24th, the 103rd continued to batter German lines, sustaining heavy losses as they did so. Finally, on July 25th, the regiment was relieved from the lines and finally given a rest. It'd been on frontline positions since July 4th. Losses from this campaign were 157 killed in action, 540 wounded, 304 gassed, and 14 missing in action, 50% casualties, the highest in the division. What they had done was put the Germans in their first retreat, and the Germans would be retreating until November 11th, until the very end of the war. Now, I know I'm running over on time. I think we're supposed to be doing Q&A soon. So I don't know if you want, I definitely keep going. Obviously there's lots to talk about. I can also conclude with just a little bit on how World War I and our Maine soldiers are commemorated in France today.
Can we get you going until 7:15, which will still give us 15 minutes for Q&A?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, you're on.
All right. So as I said, the Enmarne American Cemetery, an absolutely beautiful place tucked away in the French countryside. There's the grave of Lucien Arsenault and his Distinguished Service Cross. Now, across the street from the American Cemetery is the town church for the town of Belleau. It had been destroyed by artillery fire in the fighting. It was rebuilt after the war using subscription funds raised by soldiers from the 26th Division. So literally Guard members took this out of their paychecks to donate it to rebuild this church. In gratitude, the town of Belleau dedicated it to the Yankee Division, to the 26th Division. It is now known as the Yankee Division Church. And when you walk through the giant wooden doors in the front, this is the first thing you see. It is unreal because you don't expect to see a Maine flag anywhere in France. But you have all the New England flags, the flag of the division. Round the walls are the names of the war dead. The stained glass windows contain the seal of every state in New England. That's the Maine state seal up there. And the altar is made out of Maine granite. It is a very small piece of New England that's tucked away into the French countryside. And it is one very small piece that shows and demonstrates the French gratitude for Americans in World War I. I cannot even tell you the number of times that I've been over there, been in uniform, and had random people stop me and thank me, especially out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, these are farm towns. I mean, think it looks like Wisconsin or Pennsylvania, Ohio. And these small towns actually we were filming the documentary, and some farmers came up to kind of see what we were doing, and they saw myself and another colleague who were in uniform, and they started talking very quickly, and we asked the interpreter, what are they saying? And he said, well, they're thanking you for World Wars I and II. And I went, well, I don't know that I had much to do with that, but it's a remarkable experience, to that memory that they have, that young Americans volunteered to come across to help save them in their hour of need. From August 4th to 27th, the 103rd finally was able to catch its breath in a rest area. They received replacements, mainly from the Midwestern states. But then on 27 August, they began a series of night marches in secrecy towards a new front, the Saint-Mihiel salient. Now, they'd been there before on the southern edge of the salient. So you can see here. They'd been down on the bottom near Apremont, Fleury, down where Zivray was. Now they're up on the top, right where the large 26th is. The idea being this is the first all-American offensive. And the idea was that they were going to drive the 26th Division and the 1st Division down there on the bottom towards the town of Vigneaux, directly in the middle. And these two divisions would seal basically the pocket of the Germans and prevent their escape and eliminate the Saint-Mihiel salient as it had existed from 1915. We've seen the map reference before, but you see down there the Saint-Mihiel salient on the southern edge of the line. Now, this is a conventional World War I battlefield. Lines of trenches, blasted no man's land. The whole attack was preceded by a 7-hour barrage from 202 guns, shaking the earth. And at 8 a.m., the infantry went over the top, rushed down on the shell-shocked Germans, scooping up dozens of prisoners, some men capturing 40 by themselves. In one trench, they actually captured a whole battalion of 900 men. And you had the delightful incident of 24-year-old Captain Sherman Shumway from Bangor receiving the surrender of a German count who demanded that he deliver his surrender to someone with more rank. And they sort of indicated that that wasn't going to happen. German defense stiffened. And after some time, the Germans began to put up fierce resistance. And here you have the experience of Henry Late earning the Distinguished Service Cross. 21 years old, from Bangor, from the small Jewish community there. He advanced into the open to draw enemy machine gun fire with 2 other men, to draw German machine gun fire to them, so that way their comrades could outflank them. Late engaged the Germans, trying to pin them down until the flanking platoon could get there. He was successful, but he was struck with multiple machine gun rounds and killed. His actions won him the Distinguished Service Cross. Lieutenant Frank Burbank again. Now we see him looking much happier on the September 12th with many of the prisoners that he'd seized. German lines, as they appeared at the time, dozens and dozens of prisoners. I'm going to go ahead and push through here because I want to take us to November 11th because, of course, that's what today is. But the cost of 17 killed in action, 17 wounded, and 95 slightly wounded in action. The 103rd captured over 1,000 prisoners, multiple field guns, scores of machine guns. Very, very successful assault. And as Sergeant Russell Adams from Rumford said, this one was a picnic compared to Chateau Thierry. It was too bad all of our fights couldn't have been like Saint-Mihiel. We'll push through here. So in September and October, the 26th Division moved into the region of Verdun. Of course, this is sort of carries a lot of, obviously carries a lot of feelings with it. This is part of the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, America's largest, longest, and bloodiest battle from September 26th to November 11th. From this time, I'll just read you what the regimental surgeon wrote of arriving in the Verdun sector. The ground is all torn up by shells and old bones, skeletons, German boots with feet and leg bones sticking out of them, old casks, cartridges, belts, rifle barrels, tin cans, and trench refuse show how they lived and died in those battles. No one can describe these sights to you except your own eyes, and we live in the same holes as if there was nothing unusual around us. This had been an area that was in massive fighting in 1915 and 1916, especially surrounded the French saying that they would stand and fight at Verdun, which they did, but at the cost of 1 million casualties. The weather was terrible. Men dug into hillsides to find whatever protection they could. Disease, especially the Spanish influenza, the influenza of 1918, ran rampant, and the regiment was down to about 500 effective soldiers when they had started with 3,800. On November 8th, the Germans began to pull back. And the 1st Battalion pushed forward, following the retreating Germans into the town of Flabas and then some woods beyond. They were halted for the night, replaced by the 2nd Battalion in the morning, which took over the advance, driving hard at the next German position. After 12 hours of combat, they managed to break one German line, but were defeated by the 2nd, and so they dug in for the night. On the morning of November 10th, last full day of the war, the 3rd Battalion advanced through the fog up the slopes of the Bois de Vie under heavy German fire. Private George Stevens, one of the last Passamaquoddy, was shot through the legs helping a wounded soldier off the battlefield. And nearby, Moses Neptune, the chief's son, was killed in the advance. Finally, Company K was able to move around the right, outflank the Germans, snapping up 24 prisoners, breaking the line, and all 3 battalions went into the position on the night of November 10th, ready to advance in the morning. November 11th dawned. Everyone had an inkling that the armistice had been signed. Regimental signal stations had intercepted the wireless communication. Everyone knew what was coming. The order came down at 9:15 that only the artillery would fire, but there would be no advance. But at 10:45, orders came in for a general advance to be stopped at 11 o'clock. So each battalion advanced 200 to 300 meters, straightening out the line. Several men were wounded, and the very last man to be killed in action from the 103rd was Leon LeBonville, Corporal Leon LeBonville from Hulton, who had survived the entire war up to this point. And at 11 o'clock, the last guns fired off their salvos, the last machine guns stopped rattling, and everything fell silent. The men collapsed where they were, too exhausted to celebrate. There was celebration behind the lines, but pretty much the remarks of every soldier who was on the line that morning said that some men fell asleep, some men ate, but there was really no celebration. but their war was over. Peace came at an immense cost to the 103rd. 371 men had been killed in action. Another 21 died from disease or accident. Around 2,000 men were listed as wounded, but this number did not report all the wounds, so this number is actually too low. November 14th, they were relieved from their position, moved back to a rest area, and began the long wait. For those of us who have deployed, this is very familiar. Their war was over, but it would not be until April that they began to come back to New England. They boarded ships. They arrived in Boston Harbor, filled with cheering crowds welcoming them home. On April 25th, the whole Yankee division assembled for one last time, the Grand Review through Boston. And largest crowd to be in Boston since the until the 2004 World Series Red Sox win. And after this, the men were mustered out and sent home from Camp Devens. Colonel Hume returned the colors of the regiment to Governor Milliken at the State House, as you can see there. And I'm just going to leave you with this quote from unknown member of Company G after the war. Time dims the memory for dates and names of places, and even the whine of shells is like some far-off nightmare. Perhaps we try to forget and remember only too well as we meet daily our comrades of those past days, and remembering, think of some who never came back. Thank you so much for learning about the soldiers of the 103rd. There's so much more. If you would like to know more about these experiences of these young men and many young women as well who served in the, women from Maine who served in the Red Cross and the YWCA, who were up on the front lines with the regiment many times. You can order for free from our new Army University Press, the book To the Last Man. I think they did a great job with the art on it, because that's actually from one of those photos that we saw.